The Curse of the Sleeping Princess. Chapter 1. The Curse. The night was darker than any before it, the moon hidden behind thick, swirling clouds that seemed to choke the very air with their oppressive weight. The kingdom of Stefan had always been a place of light and warmth, a beacon in the midst of a wild and untamed land. But on this night, an unnatural stillness had settled over the land, as if the world itself were holding its breath. In the grand castle, the sounds of celebration filled the halls. King Stefan and Queen Leah had invited nobles from every corner of the kingdom to celebrate the birth of their long-awaited daughter, Princess Aurora. The grand ballroom was alight with the flicker of 1,000 candles, their flames casting a warm glow over the finely dressed guests who danced and laughed with joy. Aurora lay in her crib at the center of the room, a delicate infant wrapped in silks, her tiny face serene as she slept. Around her the three good fairies, Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather, hovered, their wings shimmering in the candlelight. They had bestowed upon her gifts of beauty, grace, and song, and the gathered crowd marveled at the tiny princess who would one day rule over them all. But as the final toast was raised, a cold wind suddenly swept through the hall, extinguishing the candles in a rush of darkness. Gasps filled the room as the flames sputtered out, leaving only the dim glow of the fireplace to cast long, flickering shadows on the walls. The great doors of the ballroom creaked open, and there she stood, Maleficent, the dark sorceress. Her tall, thin figure was draped in a robe as black as the night outside, her sharp features illuminated only by the faint green glow of the magic that pulsed in the staff she held. Her presence alone seemed to drain the warmth from the room, leaving a chill that crept into the bones of all who beheld her. King Stefan. Maleficent's voice was a silken whisper, yet it carried with it the weight of an ancient and terrible power. How rude of you not to invite me to the celebration of your daughter's birth. Stefan, though taken aback, stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at him. Maleficent, you are not welcome here. Leave this place and take your darkness with you. A twisted smile curled the sorceress's lips. Oh, I shall leave, she purred, but not before I bestow my gift upon the princess. The crowd parted as Maleficent glided toward the crib, her eyes fixed on the innocent child within. The fairies tried to intervene, but with a wave of her hand, she sent them hurtling to the far corners of the room, their wings limp and powerless against her dark magic. Leah screamed and Stefan drew his sword, but with a mere flick of her wrist, Maleficent froze them both in place. The entire hall was paralyzed, as if time itself had stopped in the presence of her malevolent. Standing over the crib, Maleficent looked down at Aurora with eyes as cold and empty as the void. She raised her staff and the green light intensified, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I too shall give the princess a gift, Maleficent intoned, her voice now a venomous hiss. But mine is a gift of prophecy. Before the sun sets on her 16th birthday, she shall prick her finger on the spindle of a spinning wheel and fall into a sleep like death. A flash of green light exploded from her staff, enveloping the crib and the child within. The air crackled with dark energy, and the very stones of the castle seemed to groan under the weight of the curse being woven into the fabric of the infant's life. With a final triumphant laugh, Maleficent turned and strode toward the doors, her figure dissolving into a cloud of black smoke that vanished into the night. As the spell lifted and the guests began to stir from their paralysis, the full horror of what had just transpired sank in. The joyous celebration was forgotten, replaced by a suffocating dread. Aurora, still asleep in her crib, seemed untouched by the curse, but all knew the terror that awaited her in the years to come. The three fairies, regaining their strength, rushed to the crib, their hearts heavy with despair. Though they were powerful in their own right, Maleficent's magic was ancient and potent, far beyond anything they could counter. But Merryweather, the youngest and boldest of the three, stepped forward, determination burning in her eyes. We cannot undo the curse, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. But we can soften it. Though she will fall into a deep sleep, she shall not die. Instead, she will sleep until true love's kiss breaks the spell. The other fairies nodded solemnly, and together they cast their own spell, weaving it into the fabric of Maleficent's dark magic. But they knew it was a fragile hope, a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness that had descended upon the kingdom. As dawn approached and the first light of day broke through the windows, the kingdom of Stefan lay in the shadow of a curse that would haunt them for years to come. The once bright future of the land was now shrouded in uncertainty and fear, as the threat of Maleficent's prophecy loomed ever closer. And so the years passed, with Aurora growing in beauty and grace, yet always under the watchful eyes of the fairies and the shadow of the curse that hung over her like a dark cloud. The kingdom waited, holding its breath, for the day the prophecy would come to pass. But as Aurora's 16th birthday approached, strange things began to happen in the kingdom. The nights grew longer, the winds colder, and in the darkest corners of the castle, whispers of something terrible began to stir. A nightmare awakening, ready to claim its due. The first chapter closes with a sense of impending doom. The seeds of horror firmly planted, ready to grow into the darkness that will soon engulf the kingdom. Chapter 2. The Deep Sleep. The sun had barely risen above the horizon when the signs began to appear. In the small villages that dotted the kingdom, farmers awoke to find their crops wilted and blackened, as if a blight had swept through the fields overnight. In the forests, the once lively songs of birds had fallen silent, replaced by an eerie stillness that unsettled even the bravest of hunters. The sky, once bright and clear, was now perpetually overcast, with dark clouds swirling ominously above the kingdom. In the castle, the sense of unease had grown into a palpable dread. The day of Aurora's 16th birthday had arrived, and with it, the shadow of Maleficent's curse. Despite the fairies' efforts to hide her away in a secluded cottage deep in the forest, the princess had been brought back to the castle to celebrate her birthday with her family. But as the morning wore on, strange and inexplicable events began to unfold within the castle wall. The fires in the great hearths flickered out, plunging the corridors into unnatural darkness. Cold drafts swept through the hallways, carrying with them faint whispers that no one could decipher, but that filled the hearts of all who heard them with a chilling fear. Aurora, oblivious to the growing tension around her, wandered through the castle, her thoughts full of the excitement of her birthday. She had been told nothing of the curse that hung over her life, the fairies having decided long ago to keep her in blissful ignorance. They believed that shielding her from the truth would protect her, but as the hour of her fate approached, that decision seemed increasingly fraught with peril. In a quiet corner of the castle, Aurora came upon a door she had never seen before. It was old and worn, the wood dark with age, and yet it seemed to call to her, beckoning her closer. She hesitated for only a moment before curiosity overcame her, and she reached out to grasp the cold iron handle. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled up into darkness. Without a second thought, Aurora began to climb, her footsteps echoing eerily off the stone wall. The air grew colder as she ascended, and a strange, otherworldly hum filled her ears, as though the very castle itself were alive and watching her. At the top of the stairs, Aurora found herself in a small, dimly lit room. At its center stood an old spinning wheel, its wooden frame creaking softly as it spun, though no one touched it. The spindle gleamed in the low light, sharp and beckoning, like a hidden predator waiting to strike. Aurora stepped closer, her eyes wide with fascination. She had never seen a spinning wheel before. It was an ancient relic, long since replaced by more modern methods of weaving. And yet, something about it seemed almost hypnotic, drawing her in. As if in a trance, she reached out to touch the spindle. The moment her fingertip brushed against the sharp point, a searing pain shot through her hand, and she gasped, pulling back. But it was too late. The curse that had lain dormant for 16 years awoke with a terrible fury. A deep, resonant sound like the tolling of a great bell echoed through the castle, shaking the very foundations. Aurora's vision blurred, and she felt herself falling, the room spinning around her as darkness closed in. The fairies, sensing the shift in the castle's atmosphere, rushed to Aurora's side, but they were too late. By the time they reached the room, the princess lay on the cold stone floor, her eyes closed in a deep and unnatural sleep. A silence fell over the castle, as though the world itself were holding its breath. The fairies, their hearts heavy with despair, gently lifted Aurora and carried her to the grand chamber, laying her upon a bed draped in the finest silks. She looked as though she were merely resting, her face peaceful, but they knew the truth. She would not wake until the curse was broken. News of Aurora's fall spread quickly through the kingdom, and soon the castle was filled with weeping and mourning. King Stefan and Queen Leah were inconsolable, their grief deepened by the knowledge that this fate was one they had long feared but could not prevent. But as the day turned to night, and the candles in the castle were extinguished one by one, a new terror began to take hold. The darkness that had settled over the kingdom seemed to thicken, as though the very shadows were alive. Strange sounds echoed through the empty corridors, scratching, whispering, and the faintest of footsteps, always just out of sight. The fairies, desperate to protect the princess, cast spells of warding around the castle, but they could feel their power waning. Maleficent's magic was stronger than they had anticipated, and it was growing by the hour, feeding off the fear and despair that had taken root in the hearts of the people. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, a thick fog began to rise from the ground, creeping through the forests and over the field, enveloping the kingdom in a suffocating shroud. The once bustling streets of the towns and villages fell silent, as people retreated into their homes, locking their doors and windows against the encroaching darkness. In the castle, the air grew thick with the scent of decay. Flowers that had once bloomed brightly wilted and withered, their petals falling to the ground like tears. The grand tapestries that adorned the walls began to rot, the vibrant colors fading into dull, lifeless shades of gray. And in the deepest, darkest corners of the castle, something began to stir. Beneath the floorboards, behind the wall, and in the shadows of the great hall, dark creatures that had long lain dormant awoke. These were beings born of nightmare, twisted and deformed, with eyes that gleamed with a malevolent hunger. They moved silently through the castle, their presence felt but never seen, feeding on the fear that permeated the air. The fairies knew they could not hold off the darkness forever. They gathered in the grand chamber where Aurora slept, their once bright wings now dimmed with exhaustion. They had done all they could to soften the curse, but they knew that only true love's kiss could break it. But where was Prince Phillip, the one destined to save Aurora and the kingdom from this nightmare? As the fog thickened and the darkness deepened, the fairies could only hope that the prince would arrive in time. But as the night wore on, and the castle continued to rot from within, their hope began to wane. The deep sleep had begun, and with it, the kingdom's descent into a nightmare from which it might never awaken. Chapter 3. Philip's Descent. The journey to King Stephen's castle was supposed to be a simple one for Prince Philip. He had set out from his own kingdom with a heart full of courage and a mind filled with determination. Aurora's beauty and grace had captivated him long before he had even met her, as tales of her radiance spread far and wide. But now, on the day of her 16th birthday, those tales took on a darker tone, and Philip found himself facing more than just a quest for love. As he rode through the dense forest that bordered Stephen's kingdom, the landscape around him began to change. The trees, once full of life and rich green foliage, now appeared twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The leaves that did cling to the branches were a sickly yellow, their edges curling as if burned by an unseen fire. A cold wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Philip's horse, sensing the unnatural atmosphere, snorted nervously and resisted moving forward. But the prince urged it on, his resolve unshaken even as the path grew narrower and more treacherous. The sun, hidden behind thick, rolling clouds, cast only the faintest light on the ground below. Shadows stretched long and dark across the path, and every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, seemed amplified in the eerie silence. The deeper Philip ventured into the forest, the more oppressive the air became, heavy with a sense of foreboding that pressed down on him like a physical weight. As night began to fall, Philip found himself lost in a maze of twisted trees and thorny underbrush. The path, once clear and well-trodden, had all but disappeared, swallowed up by the encroaching wilderness. His horse, too spooked to continue, reared up, forcing the prince to dismount and lead it by the reins. It was then that he first saw them, the creatures that lurked in the shadows. At first, they were little more than flickers of movement in the corner of his vision, shadowy figures that slithered and crept among the trees. But as the darkness deepened, they grew bolder, their shapes becoming more distinct. Philip caught glimpses of twisted limbs, claws that scraped against bark, and eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. He drew his sword, the steel glinting in the dim light, and held it ready. His heart pounded in his chest, but he pressed forward, determined to reach the castle. Aurora needed him, the kingdom needed him, and he would not be deterred by shadows and whispers. Yet, as he continued, the creatures began to close in. They moved with a silent, predatory grace, their forms barely visible in the gloom, but their presence was unmistakable. Philip felt their eyes on him, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Suddenly, the path opened into a small clearing, and in the center stood a figure, a woman tall and imposing, draped in a cloak as black as the night. Her face was obscured by the hood, but Philip knew who it was even before she spoke. Prince Philip. Maleficent's voice was like silk, smooth and dangerous. How brave of you to venture so far into my domain. Philip tightened his grip on his sword, his eyes narrowing. I'm not afraid of you, Maleficent. I've come to free Aurora from your curse. A low, mocking laugh escaped from beneath the hood. Free her? Oh, brave prince, you don't understand, do you? The curse is not something you can simply break with a kiss. It's woven into the very fabric of her being, into the life of this kingdom. It's a darkness that has taken root, and it will consume everything if you do not turn back now. Philip's resolve only hardened. I will not turn back. I will save her. Maleficent sighed, almost as if she were disappointed. So be it then. But know this, Prince Philip. You are walking into a nightmare from which there is no escape. The darkness you seek to defeat has already won, and it will claim you as it has claimed so many before. With that, she vanished into the shadows, leaving Philip alone in the clearing. But the creatures that had been stalking him did not disappear. Instead, they grew more bold, stepping out from the darkness to surround him. Philip could see them now, grotesque, twisted forms, their bodies hunched and misshapen, their faces twisted into ghastly masks of hunger and malice. Philip raised his sword, ready to fight, but the creatures did not attack. Instead, they began to circle him, moving closer and closer, their low growls vibrating through the air. It was as if they were toying with him, savoring the fear they could sense radiating from him. But Philip refused to give in. He charged at the nearest creature, his sword cutting through the air with deadly precision. The blade struck true, slicing through the dark flesh, but as soon as the creature fell, another took its place. They swarmed him, their claws raking against his armor, their teeth snapping inches from his face. Philip fought valiantly, but for every creature he struck down, two more seemed to take its place. The battle was relentless, and it was clear that the prince was being overwhelmed. Blood seeped from countless cuts and gashes, his breaths came in ragged gasps, and still the creatures came, their numbers seemingly endless. In the midst of the chaos, Philip felt something cold wrap around his ankle. He looked down to see a vine, black and thorny, snaking its way up his leg. He slashed at it with his sword, but more vines emerged from the ground, coiling around his limbs, pulling him down. With a final desperate cry, Philip was dragged to the ground. The creatures closed in, their claws tearing at him, and as darkness overtook him, he heard Maleficent's voice, echoing through the night. This is your fate, Prince Philip. You cannot escape the darkness. It is a part of you now, and it will consume you, as it will consume all who dare defy me. And with that, the prince's world went black. But this was not the end for Prince Philip. In the depths of that darkness, a flicker of light remained, a small, fragile spark of hope. It was that hope that kept him alive, even as the darkness threatened to swallow him whole. Far from the castle, in a hidden glen where the sun still shone, the three fairies huddled together, their faces etched with worry. They had felt the shift in the balance of power, the growing strength of Maleficent's curse, and they knew that Philip was in grave danger. We must help him, Flora whispered, her voice trembling. He cannot defeat her alone. But Merryweather, always the most pragmatic of the three, shook her head. We can't interfere directly. Our power is too weak now. All we can do is guide him, give him a fighting chance. Fauna nodded, her eyes filled with tears. We must believe in him. He is strong and his love for Aurora is pure. That is his greatest weapon against the darkness. And so, with all the strength they could muster, the fairies cast a spell, a beacon of light to guide Philip through the nightmare that had ensnared him. It was a faint hope, but it was all they had left. In the darkness, Philip felt the warmth of that light, faint though it was. It gave him the strength to rise, to fight once more. He knew the battle was far from over, and the path ahead was fraught with peril, but he would not give up. Not as long as there was a chance to save Aurora and the kingdom. And so, with his resolve renewed, Prince Philip began to claw his way out of the darkness, determined to confront the evil that awaited him in the heart of King Stephen's castle. Chapter 4. The Battle with Maleficent. The castle loomed before Prince Philip like a massive, decaying beast. Once a symbol of power and beauty, it now stood as a grotesque monument to the curse that had taken root in its heart. Thick vines, black and thorny, crawled up its walls, choking the life from the stone. The windows, once clear and bright, were now cracked and clouded, hiding the horrors within. Philip, bloodied and battered from his battle with the dark creatures in the forest, stood at the base of the castle's gate. His sword, though still sharp, felt heavy in his hand, and every step he took echoed with the weight of the journey he had endured. The fairy's light, small and distant, flickered above him, guiding his path toward the final confrontation. With a deep breath, he pushed open the massive, creaking doors of the castle. They groaned in protest, as if unwilling to let him enter, but they gave way under his strength. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of rot and decay, and the dim light barely illuminated the vast, empty hall that stretched before him. Philip stepped cautiously into the darkness, his senses alert. The castle was eerily silent, save for the occasional distant drip of water or the soft scurrying of unseen creatures in the shadows. The grand tapestries that once depicted scenes of glory and triumph now hung in tatters, their colors faded and their fabric eaten away by time and neglect. As he made his way deeper into the castle, the sense of dread that had followed him throughout his journey grew stronger. It pressed down on him, making it difficult to breathe, but he forced himself to continue. He had come too far to turn back now. Aurora was here, somewhere in this cursed place, and he would find her, no matter what stood in his way. At last, Philip reached the grand staircase that led to the upper chambers of the castle. The steps were cracked and uneven, as though the very foundation of the castle was crumbling beneath him. As he ascended, the oppressive darkness seemed to close in around him, the walls narrowing as if the castle itself were trying to swallow him whole. When he reached the top, he found himself in a long corridor, lined with doorways that led to who knew where. But at the end of the corridor, one door stood out from the others. It was larger, more ornate, and it seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent light. Philip knew without a doubt that this was the door that would lead him to Maleficent and to Aurora. He approached it cautiously, his sword at the ready. The air grew colder with each step, and a low, almost imperceptible hum filled his ears. It was the sound of dark magic, powerful and ancient, vibrating through the very walls of the castle. With a steadying breath, Philip reached out and pushed the door open. The chamber beyond was vast and dimly lit, the walls lined with tall, narrow windows that let in only the faintest of moonlight. At the center of the room stood a great stone platform, and upon it lay Aurora, as still and pale as death itself. She was draped in a tattered gown, her golden hair spread out around her like a halo, her lips as red as blood. She looked as though she were merely sleeping, but Philip knew better. Standing at the foot of the platform was Maleficent. Her form was cloaked in shadow, her features barely visible, but Philip could feel the immense power radiating from her. It was a dark, suffocating force that seemed to warp the very air around her, distorting reality itself. Maleficent turned slowly to face Philip, her eyes glowing with an eerie green light. A cruel smile twisted her lips as she regarded the prince. "Welcome, Prince Philip," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "You've done well to make it this far, but I'm afraid your journey ends here." Philip raised his sword, pointing it directly at Maleficent. "I've come to free Aurora and end your curse, Maleficent. This ends now." Maleficent laughed, a low, mocking sound that echoed off the stone walls. "You are a brave fool, aren't you? Do you truly believe you can defeat me? You've seen what I am capable of, the power I wield. This kingdom is mine, and soon so will your life be." With a flick of her wrist, Maleficent unleashed a wave of dark energy that hurtled toward Philip. He barely had time to react, raising his sword just in time to deflect the blast. The force of it sent him stumbling back, but he quickly regained his footing, his resolve unshaken. Maleficent's eyes narrowed. "You are more resilient than I anticipated. No matter. You will fall, just as all the others have." With a snarl, she raised her staff, and the room around them began to shift and change. The walls seemed to close in, twisting and warping into grotesque shapes. Shadows stretched and writhed across the floor, forming into monstrous creatures that snarled and snapped at Philip. Philip swung his sword, cutting through the shadows, but they reformed almost instantly, driven by Maleficent's will. He fought with everything he had, his movements a blur of steel and determination, but the dark magic that filled the room was relentless, and it was only a matter of time before it overwhelmed him. As he battled the shadow creatures, Maleficent watched with cold amusement, her smile never faltering. "You are strong, Prince Philip, but strength alone will not save you. This castle is alive with my power, and it will devour you whole." Philip felt the exhaustion beginning to creep into his limbs, his movements slowing as the weight of the battle took its toll. The creatures were endless, and for every one he struck down, another rose in its place. It was a battle he could not win by sheer force alone. But then, as the darkness closed in around him, Philip heard it, the faint, distant sound of the fairies' light. It was a soft, melodic hum, barely audible over the chaos, but it filled him with a renewed sense of hope. He remembered their words, the strength they had placed in him, and he knew that this battle was not just his own. With a cry of determination, Philip focused all his energy on the light. He closed his eyes, blocking out the shadows and the darkness, and allowed the light to fill him, to guide him. It was a warmth, a purity that cut through the suffocating evil that surrounded him. When he opened his eyes, the fairies' light had grown brighter, its golden glow illuminating the chamber. The shadow creatures recoiled, hissing and writhing as the light touched them, their forms dissolving into nothingness. Maleficent snarled in anger, her eyes narrowing to slits. "No, this cannot be." Philip turned to face her, his sword now glowing with the same golden light. "Your darkness has no power here, Maleficent. This ends now." With a powerful swing, Philip struck at Maleficent with his sword, the blade cutting through the dark magic that surrounded her. Maleficent screamed in fury, her form flickering and distorting as the light engulfed her. The power she had wielded for so long, the curse she had placed on Aurora, was being undone before her very eyes. In a final desperate attempt to regain control, Maleficent raised her staff and called upon the last of her magic. The room shook as a vortex of darkness swirled around her, threatening to pull Philip in. But the fairy's light held strong, anchoring him in place, and with one final strike, Philip shattered the staff, breaking the curse once and for all. Maleficent let out a blood-curdling scream as the dark energy consumed her, and with a flash of blinding light, she was gone. The room fell silent, the oppressive darkness lifting as the curse was broken. The shadows retreated, the twisted walls returned to their original form, and the air was filled with the soft glow of the fairy's light. Philip, breathing heavily, looked down at the stone platform where Aurora lay. Her face was peaceful, her chest rising and falling with the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. The curse had been broken, but she had yet to awaken. With trembling hands, Philip sheathed his sword and approached the platform. He knelt beside Aurora, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what he had to do, but the fear of failure gnawed at him. What if the kiss didn't work? What if the curse was too strong? But as he looked at Aurora, her beauty and grace undiminished even in sleep, his fear melted away. He loved her truly and deeply, and he knew that love was the key. Philip leaned down and gently pressed his lips to hers. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, slowly, Aurora's eyelids fluttered, and she took a deep breath. Her eyes opened, and she gazed up at Philip, her expression one of wonder and confusion. "Philip," she whispered, her voice soft and filled with disbelief. Philip smiled, tears of relief welling in his eyes. "Yes, Aurora. It's me." Aurora sat up, looking around the chamber, the memories of the curse and the darkness that had surrounded her fading like a distant nightmare. She reached out and took Philip's hand, her touch warm and real. "You saved me," she said, her voice filled with awe. Philip nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He had saved her, but more than that, they had saved each other. As the first rays of dawn broke through the windows, the light bathed the castle in a warm golden glow. The curse was broken, and with it, the kingdom began to awaken from its long nightmare. But the battle had taken its toll. The castle, the land, and the people would bear the scars of Maleficent's dark magic for years to come. And though Aurora and Philip had triumphed, they knew that the shadow of the curse would linger in their memories. Yet, as they stood together in the light of the new day, they knew that they had the strength to face whatever came next. For in the end, it was not the darkness that had won, but the light, and the love that had guided them through it. Chapter 5. The Awakening. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its golden light over the kingdom that had long been shrouded in darkness. The thick fog that had clung to the land began to dissipate, revealing the green fields and forests that had once been vibrant and full of life. Birds returned to the trees, their songs filling the air with a melody that had been absent for what felt like an eternity. In the castle, a sense of peace and calm settled over the halls that had once echoed with the sounds of despair and fear. The oppressive darkness that had choked the life from its walls was gone, replaced by a warmth that seemed to emanate from every stone. The people, who had hidden in their homes, began to emerge, blinking in the sunlight as if waking from a long, terrible dream. In the grand chamber, where Aurora had lain under the curse for so many years, the young princess now stood at the window, looking out at the kingdom she had been isolated from for so long. Her golden hair caught the light, shining like a halo around her, and her eyes, once filled with the terror of nightmares, were now clear and bright. Beside her, Prince Phillip watched her with a quiet reverence, still in awe of the miracle that had brought them to this moment. The battle with Maleficent, the darkness that had threatened to consume them all, seemed like a distant memory now, as if it had all been a bad dream from which they had finally awakened. Aurora turned to Phillip, a soft smile playing on her lips. "It's over, isn't it?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. Phillip nodded, reaching out to take her hand. "Yes, it's over. The curse is broken, and the kingdom is free." Aurora squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with gratitude and love. "I couldn't have done it without you. You saved me, Phillip. You saved us all." Phillip shook his head, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "No, Aurora. It was your strength, your light, that saved us. I was just the one lucky enough to be by your side." Aurora blushed, the warmth of his words spreading through her like a balm. She knew that the darkness had been real, the curse a terrible force that had nearly destroyed everything she held dear. But she also knew that it was the love they shared that had guided them through the shadows, bringing them back into the light. As they stood together, the door to the chamber creaked open, and the three fairies, Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather, floated in, their wings shimmering in the sunlight. Their faces were alight with joy, though there was a hint of weariness in their eyes, a reflection of the long struggle they had endured to protect Aurora. "Oh, our darling princess!" Flora exclaimed, her voice thick with emotion. "You're awake and you're safe. We feared we might lose you." Aurora moved to them, embracing each of the fairies in turn. "You never lost me," she whispered. "You were always with me, even in the darkest moments." Merryweather sniffled, wiping a tear from her cheek. "We're just so glad it's over. That horrible Maleficent. She won't be troubling anyone ever again." Fauna nodded, her gentle smile full of relief. "The kingdom can finally heal. The people can live in peace again." Aurora looked back at Phillip, her heart full of hope for the future. "And we will help them. Together we will rebuild what was lost." Phillip smiled, his heart swelling with pride for the woman who stood before him. She was no longer just a princess. She was a beacon of hope, a symbol of resilience and courage. "Yes, Aurora. Together, we will restore this kingdom to its former glory." As the day wore on, the castle filled with the sounds of life returning. Servants bustled about, preparing for the celebrations that would mark the end of the curse. Nobles and commoners alike gathered in the great hall, their faces alight with joy as they prepared to welcome their princess back into the world. But amid the joy, there was also a somber recognition of the cost of their victory. The scars left by Maleficent's curse ran deep, not just in the land, but in the hearts of the people. The years of darkness had left their mark, and there would be much work to do to heal the wounds that had been inflicted. As the evening approached, a great feast was held in the castle's grand hall. The tables were laden with food and drink, and the sound of music and laughter filled the air. It was a celebration not just of Aurora's return, but of the resilience of the people who had survived the darkness and come through stronger on the other side. Aurora and Phillip sat at the head of the table, their hands intertwined as they watched the festivities. The fairies flitted about, adding their magic to the celebration, creating dazzling displays of light and color that left the guests in awe. As the night wore on, Aurora felt a sense of peace settle over her, a feeling that had been absent for so long. The weight of the curse, the terror of the nightmares, had finally lifted, and she could breathe freely again. She looked at Phillip, her heart full of love and gratitude, knowing that they had faced the darkness together and emerged victorious. When the last of the guests had left and the hall was quiet once more, Aurora and Phillip walked together through the castle gardens. The moon was high in the sky, its light casting a soft glow over the flowers that had begun to bloom again, a sign that the land was beginning to heal. Aurora paused beside a blooming rose, its petals a deep, vibrant red. She reached out to touch it, feeling the soft, velvety texture beneath her fingers. "It's strange," she said softly, "to think that so much darkness could come from something so small." Phillip nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her word. Darkness can grow from the smallest seed, but so can light. And it's the light that will always find a way to break through, no matter how deep the darkness. Aurora turned to him, her eyes shining with tears. "I'm so grateful for you, Phillip. You were my light when I was lost in the darkness." Phillip pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her in a warm embrace. "And you were mine, Aurora. Together we will keep that light alive, no matter what comes our way." As they stood together in the moonlit garden, the future stretched out before them, full of promise and hope. The shadows of the past would always be a part of them, a reminder of the darkness they had faced, but it was the light of their love that would guide them forward. And so the kingdom began to heal, its people finding strength in the love and courage of their prince and princess. The scars of the curse would fade with time, and the land would once again flourish under the light of a new dawn. But the tale of Aurora and Phillip would be told for generations to come, not just as a story of love and bravery, but as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the light of hope can never be extinguished. The end. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to hit the like button. Thank you for your attention.